Alright guys, welcome back to Formula 1 news. Max Verstappen equals Sebastian Vettel's all-time record of 9 Grand Prix wins in a row in an absolutely crazy race in Zandvoort, but Mercedes and George Russell catching the attention for the wrong reason today with an absolutely atrocious strategy call at the start of the Grand Prix that Russell and Hamilton were not at all happy about as it transpired, leaving the team with barely any points at the end of the day, especially with Alonso picking up a podium. Very much intrigued to your thoughts in the comments below. Do Mercedes need to look at serious changes to their strategy team because it's not been impressive lately? Hit the like button if you enjoy, subscribe if you're new as always. Just before we begin, wanted to mention that the rain was absolutely crazy today, and this was right towards the end of the Grand Prix. There was also this comment from Charles Leclerc, who said even before the race began that in qualifying the car was understeering, oversteering. It was an absolute nightmare. They had to rebuild a lot of the car as well, and he had damage that he picked up during this Grand Prix. But man, what a crazy race this was. So we thought it was going to be like 20 minutes into the race when the rain arrived. Hamilton was the only car on the grid on mediums, and that is worth noting. Okay, not the worst idea in the world if you think the rain is going to be quite a way out and you think the deg is going to be high, but immediately I saw Hamilton on mediums, I was like, this seems very questionable. Alonso with a phenomenal start here actually got ahead of Russell and then got Norris on the next lap. Verstappen was basically driving away at this point, but immediately the rain was hammering down out of turn 11, turn 12, where the grandstands are. You could see the rain after just lap 1 was all over the shop, and I thought, you've got to pit, surely. This looks like in this conditions, you're going to need those tyres. Now, if you're Verstappen, you can't really pit. It's difficult to, because you don't really know. You don't know what the team's telling you. You're the first driver there to come near the pit, so you know, Verstappen didn't pit, but Perez did. And as soon as you see Red Bull make the right decision in these situations 99% of the time. As soon as I saw Perez pit, I was like, all right, that's the right decision. But honestly, I thought it was pretty obvious. And Hamilton is going past the pits on medium tyres. Like, look, the medium might be a few tenths of a second slower in dry conditions. In wet conditions, the medium is seconds per lap slower than the soft tyres. Just because that slight difference in rubber strength, the soft is just way better than the mediums. He would just be an absolute sitting duck, as he was if he stayed out. And Mercedes kept him out. Seemed like the perfect chance for Mercedes to go for the slightly risky option, bring Hamilton in, because he's going to get eaten alive on those mediums, as he did, and put him onto the inters. They didn't do this, though, but, you know, most other teams, especially Red Bull, as always, made the right call. Put Perez on the inters and gains, like, 15 seconds on the outlap compared to the other cars, because the inters, like, it was very clearly wet conditions at this point. But still, Mercedes and other teams thought, well, can we survive this, you know? Like, it's going to stop raining at some point. Can we just stick it out on these tyres and hope that we can last through it? And it seemed pretty obvious with most people, given the fact that Perez had gained 15 or so seconds. Like, he gained 7 seconds in just the middle sector. It's pretty clear that even if your tyres can survive through the wet, you're going to be so far behind and you're going to lose so much time. At that point, it just didn't seem to be worth it at all. Now, Ferrari made the correct decision to pit Leclerc after the first lap, but actually it wasn't Ferrari's decision, because apparently Leclerc had told them, like, hey, I'm gonna pit. They wanted him to stay out. The wrong decision. He came into the pits and they didn't even have the inters ready. It's like, come on, Ferrari, what else do you think is going on? It's just started raining. Why have you not at least got the tyres ready? I guess they didn't expect Leclerc to come in because they told him not to, but he made the right decision. He comes into the pits, they don't have the tyres, they can't get them on in time, and it's like, you know, Ferrari messed up by just operationally, by bottling the pit stop, as Red Bull absolutely didn't. Mercedes messed up by just completely bottling the strategy call. And the teams that got it right found themselves in this position. So Verstappen was then having to make his way through Gasly and Zhou, maybe push Gasly off track a little bit, but neither of them seemed to care too much because it was going to happen anyway. Then got Zhou eventually, and Perez was like 15 seconds up the road. By the way, at this point of the race, Zhou and Gasly were closing in on Perez. Like, you know, no comment, but come on. So anyway, Verstappen gets these two guys and then he's making his way through. And in some of the most chaotic laps that I've really ever seen at the start of a Grand Prix, it looked like it was almost qualifying. You had drivers on slicks, drivers on inters, and, you know, the guys on inters were just weaving through as if the other guys were letting them through. It was just comedy, to be honest. But still, it ends up with, after lap 6 or so, a Red Bull 1-2. Like, you know, all that chaos, and it's still a Red Bull 1-2, largely because they just don't get the strategy wrong. At this point, Hamilton Hamilton is getting absolutely rinsed. He's already been lapped basically at this point. He's way down the order. Hamilton found himself in like P18 or something at one point, and Russell was down there as well because they also told Russell to stay out to Mercedes and were like, oh, we'll survive through. And then they realised we're losing too much time. We've got to pit to the Inters. And at that point, it was game over. Not only Mercedes got this wrong, McLaren and Norris, they also bottled it. They tried to keep him out. It didn't work out for them. But especially for Mercedes, this was an absolute disaster given where they were with Russell in P3, right? He had a great chance, but they got it wrong with him. And with Hamilton, it was, I would say, inexcusable, to be honest. On the mediums, like, I don't know why they didn't bring him. It doesn't make any sense to me. So anyway, Red Bull get it right, as always. And then Verstappen overtakes Perez. And this was controversial for sure. As Perez says on the radio, did Max undercut us? Usually, the lead driver gets the pit stop preference. And I know that Horner came up with some reason, we wanted to protect against Alonso and all this. But look, Verstappen would have got Perez anyway. He was closing in on him seconds a lap. It was frankly embarrassing for Checo. But maybe they did this just to preserve Perez's dignity by not allowing Verstappen to get him on track. But they pitted Verstappen first for the undercut on Perez onto the new soft tyres, which were clearly quicker at that point in the race because Albon was starting to set purple sectors again. So definitely, it wouldn't have mattered, but it's questionable from Red Bull in a way that usually it's the lead driver, it was Perez, that gets the preferential strategy, but no, they gave it to Verstappen and pretty much artificially changed their drivers around, and Perez made it clear that he didn't decide to stay out one more lap. This is where Russell then got really angry. Now, I know that people are going to roast Russell for this. I was forecast for a podium, like I deserve my podium and all this stuff, but look, you can definitely agree with what he's saying, that they started the race looking good, and the Mercedes was a quick race car. Like, it was fast. It was quicker than the McLaren. It was quicker than the Ferrari. You could see that in the hands of especially Hamilton towards the end of the Grand Prix. But, the strategy was absolutely atrocious. Now, they got bailed out, of course, by the safety car. We'll get into that. But Russell was finding himself near the back of the grid. They eventually put him on the hard tyres to see if he could possibly go to the end. And just an atrocious strategy from Mercedes with especially Hamilton, but then even Russell, keeping him out, hoping he'd survive on the softs. And then by pitting him, they could have done to Russell what Albon did, which actually was to stay out. And he did just about make it and still found himself in a respectable spot. So it was the worst of both worlds for Mercedes. And I do think serious questions have to be asked there, because when they were dominating, their car and their driver combination with Hamilton and the great cars were good enough that it didn't really matter. Nowadays, their pit stops are bad. They're like 3 seconds. Even Hamilton had like a 3.9 second stop, I think, at one point when they did the double stack. Their strategy calls aren't even that good. It's like, I think there's serious questions that need to be raised there, because on Ferrari's side, we expect bad strategy calls, we expect bad stuff operationally, but Mercedes have been weak operationally and strategically lately, and this was a bad example of it, because Hamilton would have had a far better race if they'd have pit him when they needed to, when all the other cars did it in front of them. So eventually they get bailed out of it, because they were minutes off the pace.
And then when that rain then came out, it really, as a team, we made the wrong decision. Ultimately it was the team's call, and we paid the price for that. But then we came out last, and I think after that, I was just chasing, kept my head down. I think it was a really good example of just like when you fall or stumble, just get back up and keep trying. And, I got past the McLaren, for example, on this track was not so easy to do, and I was quicker than the signs at the end. Just needed DRS.
What potential was there then, had the right decisions been made? What sort of car have you got now?
I think today, I had the pace to in the conditions, if we had made the right call, I had the pace to be challenging the top two.
Wow, okay. So
I think we would have been challenging Max, if I'm really honest. Particularly when we got to the dry, pace-wise, I think we weren't terribly far off. So, but yeah, not saying that we would beat them, but I think we would have been.
But Logan Sargent bins it in the wall, and, he's done this twice in a row. I think he had some sort of failure. Maybe it came up in his dash, like a brake-by-wire failure, so possibly it wasn't his fault. But it goes into the wall, safety car comes out, and that makes things very interesting. Now, it didn't rain for some time, and Perez ended up in P2 here. We got the restart that went down. Alonso was in a good position. And the next phase of the race was Charles Leclerc just getting eaten alive, unfortunately. He had some damage, either from his trip over the gravel or with contact somewhere. That was just costing him a lot of lap time. I think they were costing him like 20% of vertical downforce, so he was a bit of a sitting duck. Hamilton got him. He then got done by Piastri. Then he even got overtaken by Bottas, which is like, that's just pretty embarrassing. So eventually they retired the car, unfortunately. And then it was Yuki Tsunoda who was he was holding up a bit of a train here. Norris couldn't get past him, which meant that Hamilton couldn't get past him either. Norris eventually pit. I've also got to say, Liam Lawson, what a drive from him today. He actually overtook the Ferrari briefly before Leclerc got him back. He also overtook Verstappen on an outlap. I'm pretty sure he's unlapping himself, right? So like Verstappen was coming out into turn 3, and actually Lawson overtook him on the exit before then getting blue flags and having to wave him back through. But, it was pretty funny. And what a race from Lawson, right? All that chaos, and Lawson did a really commendable job today, kept it out of the wall, really impressive Grand Prix drive, and actually, I believe, placed above Tsunoda at the end of the race, which was highly impressive indeed. Leclerc's car eventually was retired. Ferrari, a complete disaster class from them going into Monza next weekend, and even Alonso had just way more pace than Sainz. The soft tyres were lasting really well around this track, and it would have been a one-stop in regular conditions here, but of course, the rain was in play. At this point, Hamilton had stopped. Russell was still out on the hards, and Tsunoda had for some reason, Tsunoda was like, oh, we'll keep you out on the softs till the end of the Grand Prix, and maybe if the rain arrived 10 laps sooner, it would have been a good decision. But that was not going to work, let's be honest. So Alonso then had a lot of pace at this point in the Grand Prix. Then even Albon got past Russell, which is really impressive. Hamilton at this point had overtaken Norris. So the Mercedes had a lot of pace in it. It's just they bottled the strategy, and Russell wasn't happy about it at all. And Hamilton, I'm sure, was pretty grateful to get where he got at the end of it. So at this point, Verstappen's pulling away. Alonso had the fastest lap here, and actually put in the fastest lap strategically at a good moment, just about when the rain was going to arrive. And this is what we saw on the mini-map, and everyone was saying, this is going to be mega rain. Russell even had a massive moment here. Like, Russell could have been out of this race multiple times. This was a mega moment while Hamilton was coming to overtake him. He eventually basically lets Hamilton pass, and very quickly, this was the conditions. I mean, it was Perez off the track at turn 1. He actually damaged his rear wing going into the wall here. Alonso went through. Loads of other drivers have as well, even Hamilton, and Tsunoda had a bit of an excursion here over the gravel, but neither of them put it in the wall like Zhou did. And poor Zhou just completely aquaplanes and slammed into the wall at some serious pace. These conditions were very clearly not going to be reasonable to last. It was absolutely evident that a red flag would have to fly. Verstappen had enough of a gap after Perez's crash and Alonso went into P2. He could pit for wet, no doubt. But this is why the wet tyre is useless, right? Because the wet tyre is only the fastest tyre in conditions where we won't race. Like, the visibility is so bad, the conditions are so bad. Whenever the wet is faster than the inter, we simply won't race in those conditions. So it's almost pointless putting the wet on, because if you're going to put the wet on, it's going to get red flagged, which is kind of why Ocon's tyre choice, when he put on the wet, fine, that's the correct tyre, but by the time that tyre is quicker, the race is going to be red flagged. I think it was the correct call to red flag it. Drivers were going all over the place. There was no real racing to be done in those conditions. It was a disaster waiting to happen. But Perez pit just before the red flag flew, and he dropped down to P6. But because of the way the countback thing works, they took it on the last sector line, and Perez eventually went back up into P3. But coming into the pit lane, he actually aquaplanes, slammed into the wall, did a bit of front wing damage there to replace, in addition to his rear wing damage that he had from the contact earlier. So he got very lucky to actually even be P3, but he also sped into the pit lane because of the aquaplaning, and therefore was penalised with a 5-second penalty. So when the race eventually got back underway, Alonso knew that all he had to do was just keep Perez in a reasonable touching distance, and Gasly knew that he just had to keep within 5 seconds and he was going to get a podium, which is exactly what happened. Now, Russell at this point was in a decent position. He actually overtook Norris quite impressively. Hamilton was trying to get Sainz, but, with no DRS. Hamilton made a good couple of attempts at it, but it didn't happen in the end. Sainz defended well, but going down here into turn 11, Russell and Norris, kind of a racing instant, I think, in the wet, tricky conditions. Russell goes down the inside, and then Norris, trying to stay on the track here, actually clips Russell's front left tyre, gives him a puncture, and then Russell's out of the Grand Prix. So I think kind of a racing instant there, and I know people will roast Russell for, almost bidding it when he was in front of Hamilton, crashing into Norris in some respects and getting himself out of the race, despite saying earlier on that, oh yeah, I deserve the podium and all this stuff. But, it was bad strategy for Mercedes, there's no doubt about it. And then Hamilton was giving it a good go to pass Sainz. He had a couple of chances, but there wasn't quite enough in it, and he was taking an interesting line coming out of turn 12 to keep his tyres cool, I think, but it was kind of compromising his run down the main straight. But at the front of the field, of course, Verstappen wins again. It's imperious, it's dominant, it's pretty much unstoppable at the moment. Doesn't matter what the conditions, what's going on, Verstappen is going to win the Grand Prix. Another very impressive drive, especially compared to Perez, who had a bit of a disaster class, to be honest, and ended up up finishing outside of the podium. But yeah, that matches Alberto Ascari, and that matches Sebastian Vettel with 9 Grand Prix victories on the bounce. Alonso was actually pretty chipper after this race and said, look, we're getting closer, finished only about 3.5 seconds behind Max, we're going to win a race soon. So he's confident that Aston Martin might be back. I think it was less Aston Martin being back, it was more Alonso being an absolute monster today. Very impressive drive, and what a result from Gasly as well. Obviously capitalizing on good strategy early on. He got a 5-second penalty actually during the race, but overcame that, especially with Perez's 5-second penalty. It was Sainz P5, Hamilton P6, Norris P7, Albon with a couple of points as well in P8, really impressive. Ocon got the final point. Both Hasses, despite having a decent chance, ended up outside of the points, and Liam Lawson P13 ahead of Tsunoda. So I think that's pretty much going to cover it for today. A lot to go through there. That was an absolutely wild Grand Prix with a familiar result, but nonetheless pretty entertaining, I've got to say, especially the start of the race. That was absolutely insane. Very much intrigued to your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoyed, subscribe if you're new, take care, and I'll see you next time.